Good afternoon. Welcome to the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion's Lunch and Learn program on diversity self-assessments. My name is Robert A. Marchman, and I am the Senior Policy Advisor on Diversity and Inclusion in the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, or OMWI. I will serve as moderator for today's program. Before we begin the formal presentations, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to address. First, the standard SEC disclaimer applicable to all speakers in today's program. This presentation is provided in the speaker's official capacities, but does not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission, the Commissioners, or other members of the staff. Logistics regarding today. All participants will be muted. The presentation will be recorded and posted on sec.gov once it is captioned. Slides will be made available after the presentation. Let's turn to today's agenda. For today's program, you will hear from SEC senior leaders in a fireside chat. There will then be a diversity self-assessment tool, DSTAT overview, and a 2022 diversity self-assessment submissions analysis discussion. Then we will answer questions that you, regulated entities, have provided to us. And last, we will have closing remarks. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce two distinguished SEC leaders whose impressive bios you have received. They will discuss their respective programs and the impact of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in their work. First, Natasha Vij-Reiner is the Director of the Division of Investment Management. Natasha was appointed to the director position in March 2024. Next, you will also hear from Nathaniel H. Benjamin, Director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. Nate was appointed to the director's position in May of 2024. Natasha and Nate, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that warm and welcoming introduction. We're going to have a fireside chat today, and we have a lot of great questions that I'm sure that you all want to hear. And so along with my colleague, Natasha, we're going to piggyback off of some of the questions that we have, and we're really excited to really just jump in today. So I'm going to start. Natasha, let's talk about your path. Please describe your path into your current position, and let's also talk about the impacts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and the considerations that those had within your respective journey.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the invite. It's a pleasure to talk with you today and together. So I've been really fortunate during my tenure at the SEC to have been able to work in multiple offices and divisions over what will be this month 23 years. My journey kind of reflects what I think is kind of the positive culture within the agency, but also the ability of the Commission to provide a diverse professional experience and opportunities to staff. I originally started out of law school, and I came into the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations and Enforcement, then went to the Division of Trading Markets, back to exams, and now into my current position. So really had a kind of a wealth of experience from an enforcement perspective and examination perspective, rulemaking perspective, and all in different levels of staff and leadership throughout the agency. And I think with every position, I've had the opportunity to work with staff within various other divisions and offices, like we work together in our new roles within the agency, and building the connections and coalitions in support of the work, whether it be enforcement investigation, an examination, or rulemaking initiative, has really helped to support the broader mission, but more importantly, has provided me personally an opportunity to kind of build the substantive expertise, but also build coalitions and positive working relationships with staff within and throughout the agency. Many of staff whom are dear friends of mine today. I've also been fortunate to work with and for a lot of staff that have given me the ability to voice my perspective and my point of view. We don't always agree in the building. It's just the way the world goes, but it's also reflective of the diverse perspectives and experience that people bring. And I think that kind of positive and inclusive environment makes us be able to end up ultimately coming to a consensus and a better path forward in all the things that we do, whether it's enforcement exams or policy initiatives. And I think all of this has kind of impacted my path throughout the agency. I don't ever want to discount kind of the value of hard work. I think that's so critical into a person's success. But without the inclusive and positive culture within the agency, I don't think I'd be where I am today. And so in my new role and now my prior role, especially as a leader, I'm kind of committed to passing it forward to others, whether as a leader and how I lead, how I engage with inside and outside the building, and ultimately my new role in IM. So you and I've talked a little bit. You've been here for 3 months, but you had a very unique path to your current position as well. And so can you describe your current position as head of OMWI, but also what's the impact on DEIA as well for you?
Absolutely. And so in terms of my path was a little different. I like to call myself a career civil servant. I've been in the federal space for about 24 years, and my service started as a part of the military, United States Air Force. And then eventually I became a DoD civilian. I worked at the State Department, OMB, Department of Ed, and AmeriCorps. And my path has really been about people. I kind of fell into the role. Originally, I wanted to be a civil rights attorney. I wanted to advocate for those that voices are often underrepresented or not heard. I ended up landing in the field of human resources, and I did every known area of HR for about 18 years. And at a point I said, this is great, but I want to do something different. I want to continue helping. I want to continue helping people, but what's another way to do it? And in my last appointment, I was the EEO director, civil rights director, and CDIO at a federal agency. And it was full circle because at that point, I was able to do the work within civil rights. I was able to advocate for those that often are not heard. And then also bringing in the DEIA lens where we looked at civil rights and EEO as the floor because that's what regulations were in order to protect protected classes. But then also putting together the culture and embedding the work into an organization's business practices, policies, and procedures. And so for me, that was the epitome of my career where I got to help people on every side of the aisle. But then when I saw the opportunity with the SEC, this was a dream job. This was, how can I do this and be in one of the best and most forward-leaning agencies within federal government? And so bringing the 24 years of human capital management, EEO, and civil rights to an agency as such, it just was the epitome. And in doing so and being able to lead the work and the mission that's here at the SEC and embedding the DEIA principles into how we are able to perform and to meet our mission is everything. So it's not when I look at DEIA, I always say that DEIA are undergirding competencies that support an overall culture-based organization. And so an organization can have a good culture, it can have a bad culture, but no matter what, it has a culture. And what are the things that we're doing to impress and to be able to put things in place or measures in place that help support a strong culture? Because that's how you get the mission done. There's two aspects of any organization, and it's one, it's your mission because that's why we're here. But the people or the human capital are the tools that we use in order to get the mission accomplished. And so my pathway started with in one way, but it really was full circle in what it was that I really wanted to do. And now I get to do that at the SEC. So it's been a great path. And so I want to talk to you with regards to observations. You've been here at the SEC for over 20 years. And so let's talk about observations on DEIA at the SEC, including senior management representation.
So I think I think it's kind of, especially with the establishment of OMWI, CIA is a core part of the mission. It's really part of our everyday. You know, I think of it not only of like in one particular nature, the diverse perspective of a really, you know, whether it's within a division or outside a division, you know, we're working with staff throughout the agency, and kind of like I mentioned earlier, the collaborative environment that we're in is really important. And I think as leaders within the agency, our role to continue to promote it. I think that staff reflect the positive culture that we present to them as leaders, whether it's through everyday meetings, projects, the events that we put on with an agency. There's so much that goes on from a cultural, diverse perspective that we celebrate within the agency, at an agency level, at a division level, at a group level, even celebrate all of our accomplishments together. But we also think about it kind of proactively in hiring. In our division, we are very proactive in trying to make sure we're reaching out and recruiting from diverse communities, especially at a younger age, because I think it is important and very impactful to recruit kind of at kind of like an early entry stage, so that you can kind of set that tone, not only for the individual but also for growth within the agency. But I think I really do. I think it's the core of what we do on a daily basis. I think you don't necessarily think about it every day, but I think it is definitely part of the thread of what we do as a leader.
So I want to piggyback off of that particular question and bring it really to your new role in investment management. And so as we think about DEIA, and we talked about the role of senior management in DEIA, what's the importance of this work in investment management?
So it's kind of no different, but I could definitely give you kind of like an IM slant, especially from an industry perspective of things that pay attention to diversity and inclusion within. We're also always looking at the industry. But diversity and inclusion is critical to the work of the commission. It benefits from diversity and background. I was surprised when I became IM director earlier this year that I was amongst a growing number of women who have served as IM director. I'm actually the 6th female IM director, which was astonishing to me. The first, Ann Jones, dates back to 1976. Which was just amazing to me that a woman would take such a leadership role so many years ago. And I think looking back at it, especially from my perspective, like from an agency that kind of moved around, that is unique, I think. Especially dating back to the 1970s. When I started, obviously haven't been here that long. I've been here a long time, but I think that wasn't always the case. I think when I started kind of as a junior attorney coming out of law school, I looked around the agency, especially from an exams and enforcement, which is kind of my early career positions were in those offices and divisions. It was different. You didn't see as many women or diverse individuals in senior positions or management positions. And that has really changed with the agency. And I think I think thinking back to how it was is I don't take it for granted, but I also don't take for granted that we need to continue to be proactive in ensuring that we're providing professional opportunities to women who are diverse and making sure we're giving them opportunities so they can succeed within or outside of the agency. Like I had mentioned, kind of as a leader, we in the division also prioritize diversity in our recruiting efforts. We had done over the last 4 years almost 60 classroom visits, just talking to potential for recruiting events, just talking about the SEC, about what we would do in the division to encourage students to think about the SEC as a potential professional opportunity. We also, we and within the division, we're not all just lawyers and accountants. We have quants and economists. And so even within the division, we kind of have a diverse experience and professionally, but also personally. And we also have a fellows program that attracts a lot of industry experts that bring a wealth of experience, but also perspective, which is very unique within our division. So I talked a little bit earlier, we focus on diversity within the agency, but we also really do pay attention to how diversity is being promoted within the asset management industry. And so I thought I would just mention now a couple things. Our ICI collected data on diversity in the industry periodically, and there was a 2022 report where they collected demographic information on women and people of color. And so they cited that 39% of employees were female, then the registered investment company industry, and 65% of the industry was identifying as white. And so I think if you look at that report, I think percentages go up, but you also sometimes see it go down. And I think it's really reflective of like the need to continue to promote diversity. You can't hit a mark and then just stop. You have to continue to, like I said, we really do go all the way to classrooms to make sure that we're starting at an early age. We're also aware of trends in the asset management firms, and some of it will go towards the survey that you're promoting the industry to respond to. But a lot of them have integrated DEI into their policy and procedures. Study looked at about 1,200 asset managers and found that 70% of them have DEI policies and 71% have diverse recruiting initiatives. And I think that is huge. And again, should probably continue. And then my final, again, a lot of work happening in asset management industry is promoting diversity. The Asset Management Advisory Committee, which was a committee that was established some time ago, and they had done a report in 2021 that talked about women and people of color. And I think that the report really showed there was an underrepresentation. And again, I think it's something we need to continue to promote. But I think, seeing us in senior roles within the agency hopefully also helps promote those in the industry to do the same. Again, it's a lot of hard work goes into it to promote diversity, but it's something shouldn't be discounted and it shouldn't be forgotten. So, I think from an IM perspective, a lot going on in this space on a daily basis, but we're also very much interacting with our industry counterparts to ensure that they're also promoting DEI, because I think we learn from each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know you're kind of new to the SEC, you're 3 months in, but how do you view DEIA and the mission work of the agency?
I see DEIA is critical when it comes to the mission work, and so much so I think about the agency's DEIA strategic plan. And when we look at the 3 pillars of the plan, it focuses on what I spoke about earlier, which are people, culture, but then lastly, mission. And so we see mission as a part of the triune when it boils down to how do we promote the culture and the people in order to support and advance the mission of the agency. And so when we look at our commitments with regards to mission, and I'm not going to go through the whole strategic plan, of course, but we make a concerted effort to show that this is what's needed in order to advance the mission of the SEC. You brought relevant and realistic stats right now that shows within asset management why this is important. We're able to see that when we look at diverse and inclusive organizations, they generally, based on data, drive more change, they drive more innovation, and they drive more results. So we want to ensure that the SEC is on par with forward-leaning organizations, and that's our responsibility, not just as an Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, but as senior leaders within the agency that help move and advance and shape what this organization looks like and how we serve the American people for years to come. So it's critical and it's pivotal, especially today in this day of work. And as the OMWI office, we're committed to make those advancements and to support the organization, which supports our overall mission.
Yeah, you mentioned the agency has a DEIA strategic plan, and I think that that's such a great representation of the on the top of promoting diversity, because it just bleeds into all that we do. And sometimes I think it's something we forget about, but it is a great strategic plan, and it gives all of us, especially as leaders, a direction as to how to promote diversity. So what are your current priorities? Again, I know you're fairly new, but we've talked a lot about it, but what are your current priorities in OMWI?
We have several. One, we're continually advancing supplier diversity, which is a part of our mandate under Section 342 of Dodd-Frank. But one aspect that we have, which is a priority and which we'll talk about a little bit further, is really our diversity self-assessment. And our diversity self-assessment is a way that we go to our regulated entities to ask them to complete this this form, or to complete this assessment, to look at their current diversity policies and practices. And part of what we do with that information, we're looking at that information, and let me first actually say this. It's separate from the regulatory functions here at the SEC. So it is a voluntary assessment that we use to really monitor trends of what's going on within our regulated entities. And it's a great way for us to be able to look across, to be able to see best practices, and to be able to share that back. And it's aggregated. It's not pointing to any entities, nor is it I got you. It's not one of those type of exercises at all. It's a great way for us to collect information, to be able to share information. And the more we have those that are sending it in and sharing it with us, and we're able to aggregate at an even better or larger rate, it creates that best practice template and tool that we can use for years to come. So if we're going to be leaders in this work, if we're going to be able to demonstrate how we support this and be forward leaning, we want to partner and should be able to show to our entities and to others where we are. That's one of our priorities. And I know that that this fireside chat and a part of this lunch and learn is really to speak to the importance of the DSAT, which is a tool that is open from June 3rd of this year, and it closes through September 30th. But it's really important, and I'm really, really excited that people will be able to be a part of this.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point about that. It's not part of our regulatory function as an agency. I can tell you from my perspective, coming from examinations, but also enforcement, I'm always been aware of the survey, especially in exams. When I was there, we would get registrants that would reach out and be like, is this your survey? What are you going to do with it? Am I going to get a deficiency letter? And we were always able to say definitively not the case. It is purely from an OMWI perspective, and it doesn't come in line with anything that from a regulatory perspective. So I think that's a really good point. And I know I've learned so much from you as to what you do with the survey, and I know others will learn more today.
Absolutely. Well, and with that, we're going to really do a deep dive into how it's used, the information that's collected, and really so that all of our listeners and viewers get a holistic view of how we use the DSAT. So at this time, I'm actually going to turn it over to Robert Marchman, who is going to introduce our next speaker. Robert, over to you.
Natasha and Nate, thank you for a dynamic and insightful presentation. Much, much appreciated. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague in OMWI, Shirley Sorn, who is Senior Counsel in OMWI. Shirley today will provide an overview of the diversity self-assessment process, and as Nate was talking about as well, discussing results from the 2022 diversity self-assessment submissions collection process. So I will, Shirley, turn it over to you. We're waiting for the slides. Here we go.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. As Robert mentioned, my name is Shirley Sorn. I am Senior Counsel for the Office of Minority Women Inclusion, otherwise referred to as OMWI. Next slide, please. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the background and history of the self-assessments of diversity policies and practices and OMWI's collection of those. So where did it come from? This started with Dodd-Frank Section 342, which required the establishment of OMWI offices. And Section 342, paragraph B, subparagraph C, instructed each OMWI director to develop standards for assessing the diversity policies and practices of entities regulated by the agency. Pursuant to this mandate, the OMWI directors of the Office of the Comptroller Currency, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Federal Deposit Insurance Company, National Credit Union Administration, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the SEC developed the Interagency Policy Statement establishing joint standards for assessing the diversity policies and practices of entities regulated by the agency. After a notice and comment period, the final policy statement was published in the Federal Register on June 10th of 2015. The policy statement, and I underscore that it's a policy statement, sets out standards for assessing an entity's diversity policies and practices in 5 areas: organizational commitment to diversity and inclusion, workforce profile and employment practices, procurement and business practices or supplier diversity, and practices to promote transparency of organizational diversity and inclusion. In 2018, the SEC began collecting self-assessments on a biennial basis, so every 2 years, based on these joint standards. Next slide. As our director, Nathaniel, mentioned, we are currently in the collection period, so in the biennial collection period. We're in our 4th collection period. The collection period started on June 3rd, and it closes on September 30th. Next slide. Okay, so I think you may have heard Nathaniel talking about the DSAT. What is the DSAT? The DSAT is the Diversity Self-Assessment Tool. OMWI developed the Diversity Self-Assessment Tool to help guide the self-assessments based on the joint standards and the interagency policy statement that we just talked about and the 5 areas discussed. It is a template for submitting a self-assessment. Some of you may recall that the prior tool was referred to as the Diversity Assessment Report, or the DAR, and that former DAR and now the DSAT was revised in 2023. The DSAT was renamed as part of the revision. There was a lot of confusion because the analysis that we did was called the Diversity Analysis Report. So people were confusing the Diversity Assessment Report self-assessment portion as well as the analysis portion. So we renamed to the Diversity Self-Assessment Tool. We also provided an option in the Diversity Self-Assessment Tool where you can opt in to have your firm's name published as having submitted a DSAT. I do want to note that the information collected is again an aggregated form, and it will not identify a particular identity or disclose confidential business information. So the substance of what you provide will still not be disclosed. It will only be presented in an aggregate form. But if you check that box, it means that we could publish your entity's name as having submitted a DSAT or have participated in the self-assessment collection. It also combined and removed some items, and we added clarifying language to some of the items and shortened the items for brevity. In total, we ended up shortening the form significantly from the prior form. It also is aligned more closely with the forms that are provided by the Federal Reserve Board and the Office of Comptroller Currency. Next slide. I'm going to go over some frequently asked questions that we've seen over the years. Who is invited to submit their diversity self-assessments to the SEC? All SEC regulated entities are welcome to submit. This includes broker-dealers, government securities brokers and dealers, municipal securities dealers, investment advisors, investment companies, and self-regulatory organizations. While everybody is invited to submit, and we more than welcome to any self-assessment submission, we send formal invitations to regulated entities that have 100 or more employees, and they are sent to primarily to your chief compliance officer. We understand that it may need to go to your chief diversity officer, maybe your chief human resources officer, maybe your chief operating officer. Feel free to forward the invitation to whatever individual is appropriate or whatever office is appropriate for completing the self-assessment. Or you can also email us at omwi-dsat@sec.gov, and we can send an invitation to whoever you designate. Another question we receive is, and both Natasha and Nathaniel went over this, is the diversity self-assessment related to the SEC's regulatory function? We want to emphasize again, no, this is completely a voluntary process. That's why they are self-assessments. We are not going in and doing the assessment. It is separate and not part of the SEC's examination process. Another question is, do you have to submit the DSAT? So do you have to submit the form that the SEC, the template form that the SEC provides that's aligned with the joint standards and the interagency policy statement? No, you don't have to submit a DSAT. It could be in any form. Sometimes we receive web pages that about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility policies and practices that companies put on their public website. It could be part of your ESG report. However, we do prefer the SEC's DSAT form just because it allows us to do greater data analysis. The vast majority of the forms that we receive are, in fact, the SEC form. Will an entity's self-assessment be made publicly available? No. As you can see from our prior diversity analysis reports that are publicly available, we only report aggregate data without identifying information. Regulated entities submitting information considered sensitive and confidential business information may request confidential treatment of information in accordance with the SEC procedures under the Freedom of Information Act, and the SEC will keep the information confidential to the extent allowed by law. Next slide. Okay, so I am going to go over some highlights from the 2022 collection. I'm sorry. Next slide, please. So from the 2022 collection, 1,327 regulated entities were sent formal invitations to participate. We received 58 submissions covering nearly 7%. The forms that we received were the SEC DAR, which is now the DSAT. Some were firm narratives, some were firm prepared templates, and some were templates. Some used the templates created by OCC, FRB, and FDIC. Next slide. The majority of the responses that we received indicated that firms' organizational commitment to diversity and inclusion, that's standard 1, as well as employment practices to promote workforce diversity and inclusion, standard 2. The majority of the firms reported that they publicize workforce diversity progress, but far fewer firms publicize supplier diversity progress. Most firms monitor their diversity progress, but just 33% use the joint standards, and if fewer than 40% publicize the results of their self-assessments. Next slide. The first link is the website that you can go to on sec.gov that has prior recordings that we've done on the self-assessment of diversity policies and practices. It includes the DSAT form that we talked about. It includes the analysis that we've done for 2020, 2022. And you can always reach out to us with any questions at omwi-dsat@sec.gov. And I'll bounce it back to Robert.
Shirley, thank you for that informative and insightful presentation. I trust that participants found it very useful. At this time, what we want to do is answer questions that were submitted to us by our regulated entities in the registration process for this program regarding the diversity self-assessment submission process. So Shirley, here's the first question. Question 1, what time period applies to the self-assessments?
That's a good question. The form does not specify what time period applies to the self-assessments, but generally we're looking for the prior full year. And that's also what aligns to the FRB and OCC. So for 2024, it would be what you have for 2023.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you balance tracking without increased risk of privacy violations or concerns about discrimination? What about tracking for intersectionality?
So the joint standards, I think this is referring to probably section 3, where we ask for some demographic information. The joint standards references the EEO1 report and AAP data. So the joint standards and the interagency policy agreement, interagency policy recognizes that the information generated from these sources is limited, and it does not account for intersectionality. But the interagency policy statement also encourages entities to use other analytical tools that they may find helpful, including intersectionality or qualitative data. The policy statement is not intended to encourage or require an entity to undertake an assessment based on numerical goals, metrics, or percentages. It is not intended to encourage unlawful usage. And in fact, the policy statement discusses not engaging in unlawful employment discrimination. Now, how this is done, we suggest that you work with your legal office.
Thank you, Shirley. And here's the last question that we received. What if a regulated entity has been invited to submit a self-assessment by another regulator? Is there a preference? You're on mute.
Thank you, Robert. Sometimes an SEC regulated entity may also be an institution identified in 12 USC section 1813Q, which contemplates that agencies can share self-assessments. Again, it can be in any form. It can be another entity, another regulator's form. However, again, we prefer the DSAT because that allows us for greater data analytics with it. I think the next preferred way would be if you submit your other regulator's form.
And those are our questions. So I thank you. All right, so we have actually reached the end of today's program. So I want to thank you all for attending today's OMWI Lunch and Learn program. I also want to thank Natasha, Nathaniel, and Shirley for their important contributions in today's program. Also want to thank Amy Ellis, our communications director, Nikisha Banks, the tech team, and also our ASL interpreters, all of whom have made very critical and really important contributions to today's program. We in OMWI hope that you found today's discussion informative and of value in connection with the submissions of diversity self-assessments, as well as your own work at your respective regulated entity with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. You have hopefully heard throughout today the value add of making the submissions to the SEC, as it is an opportunity for regulated entities to share best practices with the financial services industry. And as Nathaniel and Shirley both noted, the more information that we receive, the better position we are in is to share that information to demonstrate the value add of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the industry. We would again encourage all regulated entities who are participating today and who will look at and view this session to submit the voluntary diversity self-assessments for the reasons that we have stated. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to OMWI. We have provided you with information of how to do that, but again, you can do so at omwidstat@sec.gov. And with that, I will close out today's program and hope that you all have a great remainder of the rest of your day. Thank you.